Okay, my name's Jamie Lamb. Here is my note paper that I'll be using. So, today we're just going to touch on a few topics. So, first would be the definition of psychology, and then we're also going to specifically be going into branch of psychology called developmental psychology. I'm going to explain what it is, as well as just one of the many aspects that affect development. So one of those aspects that I'll be talking about would be communication. So it would be, for example, language, and more specifically, the language rule system. Um, so first to define psychology, psychology is the specific study of the mind and the behavior of the mind, and it also explores how we think and how we feel and how we act. So actually, one of the main roles of psychologists is to try to understand the mental processes and the emotional responses of people. And so obviously there are a lot of different factors that affect human psychology. So for example, it could be things like genetics or development or cultural influence, socioeconomic background, for example. Um, but more specifically, we're going to be looking into developmental psychology, which is a branch that focuses on certain aspects of childhood development. So that would be like childhood experiences and parenting styles and education and learning, for example. So developmental psychology explores development that occurs from birth to the end of life. So this specific branch studies the way that people and their psychology shifts due to, for example, the experiences that they've had growing up. As they grow older and as they gain more experience in their lives. It's also really important to note that actually developmental psychologists now and researchers now are trying to shift away from the more traditional route of only studying from birth to adolescence, for example. So psychologists actually are trying to study the entirety of life. So that would mean like obviously from birth all the way to even death, just because if you really think about it, a lot of development still happens throughout your lifetime, and it doesn't just stop at a certain time. It doesn't just stop when you hit adolescence or when you hit, I don't know, 15, 16, 17. People are constantly changing, people are constantly reacting to external factors. All the way up till their death. I mean, their mindset can be completely different. The way that they view the world is obviously always changing. And so developmental psychologists now are, the definition of developmental psychology to them is researching something that encompasses someone's entire life, for example, a patient's entire life. So in this lifespan perspective, researchers are again emphasizing that there's no age where development is um, more or less important, and that in adults, especially at different points in their lives, they're susceptible to a lot of different types of development that, otherwise a 5-year-old is susceptible to very different type of development as compared to like a 45-year-old. Um, so also it's important to know that in developmental psychology, you'll learn that there are a few things that you'll learn. So development is multidimensional, multi-directional, has plasticity, it's multidisciplinary, and it's contextual. So I'm going to go into I guess, every single one and describe everyone to you. So, what this means is that development, again, it continues to grow throughout all age periods, and regardless of age, those relationships are constantly changing and they're constantly affecting someone's worldview. So, that's what multidimensional means. And then now we're going to talk about multidirectional, which means that as people age, there are certain components that develop in the brain while others tend to shrink. So, a good example of this would be the ability for a child to learn a second language is obviously a lot easier for a child to learn a second language as it is as someone who's already an adult. So that's a great example of how development changes and your brain shifts. So when you're younger, you have a lot of energy to and brain function to learn a language, but then as you grow older, adults tend to be better at other aspects of life and of thinking. So, for example, they're always always wiser, usually not always, but usually wiser in um, making relationship decisions and processing, job stresses and stuff like that. And so um, it's always changing. The way that people think, the way that they process things, and what their brain puts effort toward learning is very different at a certain stage in their lives. So that's very important to keep in mind. And then the next thing is plasticity. So that means the capacity for change. So, for example, your intellectual skills don't have to be fixed by the time that you're like, I don't know, 60, 70, 80. So, actually, researchers have found that cognitive skills can actually be improved through training, and that those skills actually don't necessarily like decline. That if you really do put in the effort to train, especially among older adults, that it's completely possible to keep those skills. But obviously, we do have to keep in mind that there is less capacity for change as we grow older, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible and that no amount of training can preserve those cognitive skills and functions. So the next thing is that developmental psychology also spans across many different fields. This is also very important to keep in mind because psychology is just, it encompasses so many things, and developmental psychology specifically encompasses so many different fields. So, for example, with neuroscientists and anthropologists and even social workers, when you research developmental psychology specifically, you tend to have to look at all of these other fields to get a comprehensive view of exactly what's going on and exactly how a human processes all these external factors. Um, and then last one is that development is contextual. This is really important because um, especially for example in therapy, this is I guess a pretty good example of this is that when you go to a therapist, their main goal is to look at the way that one, patterns, the way that you've been reacting to things, what has caused those reactions, and as well as like your background and the context in which you've grown up. Obviously, the way that you develop is ties directly into the way that you operate as an adult. And so, learning and realizing that developmental psychology is contextual is really important, and taking into account that the way that someone grew up affects their development greatly has to be taken into account to completely understand exactly why they are and have developed into the way that they are now. So, some examples of this would be like looking into different historical backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic groups, and realizing that all of those things affect the way that a child develops. So, you can obviously also see this in your peers. So, you can see a vast difference between someone who, for example, grew up Asian compared to Caucasian. And you can also see that there is a vast difference between someone who grew up wealthy versus someone who grew up in a family or a household with no money. And so, obviously, context is very important in understanding someone's development and why they are the way that they are in their adulthood. Um, and this is also actually, I think it's much more, I guess, should be emphasized much more in when researching developmental psychology. For me personally, I think obviously it's emphasized to look into context, but I think that it should be pushed even more. Just because even in my last mini project that I did that I submitted a few days ago, we focused on the difference of how culture affects something that you don't even think about, like medical decision making. And so obviously growing up, Chinese, I know that in my culture, people often, or at least families or parents, often place a lot of emphasis on kind of like this tribal mindset where they want to make decisions for their children, regardless of even if they're, above the age of 18, where they technically in the standards and, laws of America, where you can make your own decisions. Culturally, Chinese and Asian people tend, and even Japanese people, for example, tend to really place emphasis on making sure that they're making a decision together and as a family. Obviously, that really clashes with the American culture just because Americans obviously really prioritize something called autonomy, which is your ability to make your own medical decisions and feel like you are completely in control and nobody else is completely in control of your own medical decisions and well-being. And so, I think also this is very important because obviously I think that in hospitals we should really look into context and the way that people grew up in order to fully treat them and make everyone around them not only the patient, but everyone around them comfortable. And I actually didn't know this, but Africans have the same mindset where, for example, if their son or daughter is 21 years old and fully capable of making their own medical decisions, that if their son or daughter is in a position where they're diagnosed with, I don't know, terminal illness, terminal cancer, that an African or an Asian parent would feel extremely, they would take offense to the fact that a doctor would not approach them before they approach their patient and letting them know that of their diagnosis. And obviously, on the contrary, with Americans, you're literally trained in the healthcare system to prioritize the patient and to let the patient know. And there's things like HIPAA to where you can't even go and basically no one's obligated, regardless of if you're of age, regardless of their relationship to you, to be able to know your medical history. And so I think that, again, very long tangent, to talk about how context is very important in developmental psychology, specifically in the healthcare field, and in understanding the way that people view the world and operate, and even in from like a medical decision making standpoint. Um, Now we're going to go into a little bit more specifics right now. So obviously communication is a large way in which we can study the way that children grow and children are able to allow their parents to know what they need or to express themselves. So we're going to talk about the language rule systems later, but in order to do so, we obviously have to define language. So seems very simple, but I'll just run over this very quickly. Language is a way that we all communicate, and that can be, it doesn't have to be just verbally or through words. It can be it could be verbally, written, or even signed, for example. Um, and as a society, we place meaning and attach it to a word, and then and or an object in order to communicate our needs. And a lot of it is also symbolism. So a language rule system, specifically, to get into more specifics, is the framework of principles that governs how a language is structured and how it's used, how it's understood, sorry, and it encompasses five different categories. So we'll go into those categories as well. So the first one would be phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So now we can go into each category. So phonology is the sound system of a language. So it's the way that language sounds. This also includes how letters sound on their own, and then how, in English, when they're combined, the sound that it makes. So very surface level understanding of language. Morphology is actually the study of the internal structure of words. So the word morphology comes from a Greek term, and it is made up of the word morph, which means shape and form, and then ology, which means the study of something. So that's more just about the structure of a word. And syntax is how words are combined to form acceptable phrases and sentences. So this one is a little bit harder to understand. So, but I guess a good example would be the sentence like Jamie is teaching Ben psychology versus Ben is being taught psychology by Jamie. So somehow when I say those two sentences, although they're different structures, we still know exactly, you and I still know exactly what we mean, or what I mean in both forms, because we have a syntactic understanding of sentence structures. And semantics is the next one. So semantics is the meaning of words and sentences. So another example would be boy and man. They both have semantic features, but they differ semantically because of the age that each word implies. Um, Also, semantics means knowing the meaning of individual words, such as, like, I don't know, apple or bat. And then last one would be pragmatics. It's the appropriate use of language in different scenarios and in different contexts or situations. So, for example, you obviously speak politely, or you're taught to speak politely to your teachers, or use polite language in appropriate situations. Um, so now we're going to talk with that in mind, and with that understanding, we're going to talk about how language affects development. And we're going to talk about that by looking at different language milestones. So from 2 to 4 months is when a baby starts to coo. So that is basically making vowel-like sounds like ooh or ah. And these aren't just random noises. Usually, they're a way for a baby to attempt to um, have connection or engage socially with whoever their caregiver is. And it's usually like a more playful interaction, but it is very key in it's a very key developmental stage where babies are now trying to learn how to connect and have that concept in their head to reach out to the people that are around them. And then at 5 months are when babies start to understand their first words. So at this point, they usually understand a few words, especially maybe like their name, or they're able to say like mom or dad, or react when they hear a name. And at 6 months, that's when the babbling begins. So this is also a very crucial phase. At this point, they're practicing a lot of sounds, and that they'll later end up using in actual words. So they'll start to experiment with the way that this sounds with like pitch or tone or rhythm. And from 6 to 12 months is when babies are actually learning language. So they are language specific listeners now. So between this 6 to 12 month phase, babies go from like just listening to everything to being able to learn specific languages and kind of like compartmentalize certain languages in their brain. And from the 8 to 12 months, babies are using specific gestures. So they're like pointing or waving or raising their arms or whatever it is. These are also like the development of nonverbal cues in order to, again, communicate. At the 13th month, they are speaking their first words, and at 18th month, they are learning significantly more vocabulary. And then from 18 to 24 months, they are oftentimes using two-word phrases, and there's a rapid expansion of the vocabulary that they're able to use. So obviously, in just like a year and a half around, a baby goes from like crying to cooing to babbling to then like knowing a specific language and being able to compartmentalize that, and then to using gestures. And then at that point, at the 18 month, they start saying cohesive, I guess, phrases or sentences. These milestones are pretty important. And they may seem small, but obviously they all bunch together, and it's like building blocks to communication. So, why this matters, obviously, understanding developmental psychology and understanding language development specifically helps us completely, or at least understand on a smaller scale, how babies and children develop and how they communicate. And it also helps us appreciate how people learn, how people grow, and how they adapt, and why adults are the way that they are. Um, it also teaches us that everyone's unique, and it's a mix of like obviously biology, culture, influences like their environment, socioeconomic backgrounds. So learning how children communicate and develop in communication is also very key in learning developmental psychology as a whole. And just to wrap up, psychology helps us understand people better, from how they behave and to how they communicate. Obviously, again, in order to learn all of these things, you have to look much deeper on a much deeper level. So you have to do a deep dive on things such as, the language and communication aspect, in order to at least even try to attempt to understand the way that people are, and the way that they develop. But developmental psychology in particular shows us that growth is ongoing, and it's very important again to realize that growth does not stop at a certain point, and that whatever happens in the brain is not more important at a developmental stage. So when you're like 5 or 6 compared to when you're 40. And again, it can continue to be influenced by so many different factors. And through language, that's one of the most important tools for learning to communicate and grow. Thank you. Bye. Wait, let me